Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The sun rose lazily over Enugu, its light spilling over rooftops like an old man pouring palm wine, careful, measured, and without hurry. In the soft hours of that morning, the city was quiet, yet not asleep. Hawkers lined the streets as they always did, the air ripe with the smell of roasted plantain, diesel fumes, and anticipation. Inside Madame Akamaka's tiny salon on Ogwe Road, 3 women sat beneath hooded dryers gossiping in hushed tones. Evelyn's name floated in and out of their whispers like incense smoke at a vigil. "Dem say Michael won disgrace her for court," one of them muttered, adjusting her wrapper. "Public divorce-o. I hear say invite press join." Another woman, chewing groundnuts, clucked her tongue. "No, that woman way no day even talk. Always calm like water for clay pot. What'n she do way reach that kind thing?" No one had the answer, but everyone agreed. Something was brewing in the belly of Enugu, and it carried the scent of scandal. Meanwhile, Michael Ward sat in a cafe near Polo Park Mall, legs crossed confidently, his leather slippers tapping against the floor like a ticking clock. He scrolled through his phone, reading and rereading the draft of his court statement like a man preparing for theater. This wasn't a divorce, it was a public cleansing, a performance. And he had sold the tickets himself. Michael had spent years polishing his image until it gleamed like a borrowed crown. From a struggling apprentice in a car parts shop in Nsukka to the owner of multiple properties in Independence Layout, his rise was the kind that made elders shake their heads in admiration, and young men want to borrow his perfume. He donated to churches, sponsored scholarships for 3 children in his former primary school, and was known to throw generous bundles of cash at traditional weddings. People called him Mr. Money, not just because of his wealth, but because of the confidence with which he carried it. He always knew the right thing to say at the right time, and his voice carried weight in political meetings and family gatherings. But behind the closed doors of their duplex in GRA, the charm wore off. The house Evelyn called home had become a cage made of glass, pretty from afar, but fragile and full of cracks. Michael no longer spoke to her with kindness. He rarely came home before midnight, and when he did, he smelled of strange perfumes and cold alcohol. He began calling her things: barren goat, dead soil, wasted space. Evelyn never responded. She simply folded her clothes, served his food, and said her prayers at night, her whispers drowned beneath the humming of the air conditioner. It wasn't that she didn't feel the sting. It was that she had long stopped bleeding. To the outside world, Evelyn was Michael's quiet shadow, a woman who spoke only when necessary, smiled with restraint, and carried herself with a kind of grace that seemed outdated. She was not the type to fight, not the type to scream. When she walked through Ojij Market with her woven bag and sun hat, traders greeted her with respect, but they often wondered if she had joy. She married Michael when she was 24, fresh from Nsukka, with the softness of youth still clinging to her cheeks. He was already on his way up, already calculating his empire. She, on the other hand, was a dreamer. She wanted to write, to open a library someday. But dreams are delicate things, and Michael had no patience for fragile ambitions. "What is the use of books when you don't even have a child?" he snapped once, his voice cold as cement floors. Over the years, Evelyn tucked her dreams away like old wrappers, used, faded, and folded into corners of forgotten chests. She became what was expected, the wife who greeted guests with chin-chin and orange juice, who smiled during Christmas photographs, who posed beside her husband at charity dinners, and never let the world see the storm that lived in her chest. Yet something about her changed that final year. Not her face, not her words, but the way she looked at Michael, quiet, calculating, as if memorizing something he wasn't aware of. The first time Michael mentioned divorce, he did it like a man announcing a promotion. They were at dinner with friends in an upscale restaurant in New Haven. He leaned back in his chair, swirling wine, and said, "Very soon, I go day single again, oh. This one no day function." He laughed, pointing at Evelyn like she was part of the decor. The room chuckled nervously. Evelyn did not. She sat still, chewing slowly, wiping the corner of her mouth with a napkin. Later that night, she stood by the window of their bedroom, watching the moonlight crawl over the compound wall. Michael snored behind her. She picked up her phone and began scrolling through photos, not of people, but of documents she had saved over time, signed receipts, transaction alerts, screenshots of messages. She was not just a woman scorned. She was a woman waiting. And Michael, in all his arrogance, was too drunk on his own voice to see that the silence he had mocked for years was not emptiness, it was storage. Every insult, every slap, every lie had been tucked away. Not in rage, not in panic, but in patience. Michael had planned a public execution. But he had forgotten one thing. When you push someone into a corner and take away their dignity, they either break or they document. And Evelyn had documented everything. Carefully, quietly, page by page. The rain started softly that evening, beating down like a tired drum on the zinc rooftops of Enugu. In the ward residence, the silence between husband and wife stretched longer than the shadows cast by the flickering wall lamps. The kind of silence that didn't come from peace, but from exhaustion. Michael walked in late, his breath carrying the scent of foreign whiskey and a trace of imported perfume. Not Evelyn's. This one was heady and sweet, the kind worn by women with too much time and too little conscience. He dropped his car keys on the polished credenza with a loud clink and muttered something unintelligible as he kicked off his shoes. Evelyn sat in the corner of the room, half buried in the armchair, her hands resting on a novel she hadn't turned a page of in weeks. She didn't rise to greet him. She didn't ask where he had been. Michael didn't offer an explanation either. He simply poured himself a glass of water, drank half, and then turned to her with a casual cruelty in his eyes that had become all too familiar. "If you're planning to keep pretending, at least do it somewhere else," he said. "You're like stale air. No taste. No smell. Just here." Evelyn blinked slowly, letting his words settle like cold stones on her chest. She didn't argue. Instead, she excused herself and walked quietly to the bedroom, the soft swish of her wrapper the only sound she carried with her. Her strength wasn't in confrontation. Her power lay in her memory. And every word, every insult, every sigh of contempt, she stored them as one would store rainwater during dry season. Not for vengeance, but for revelation. There was a small room tucked away in the far end of their house, beside the guest quarters, where Evelyn had created her own world. No one knew much about it, not even the housemaid, who was paid well enough to mind her own business. The door to that room was rarely open, but inside, Evelyn had built a quiet arsenal. Stacks of papers, neatly labeled envelopes, a drawer full of flash drives, and notebooks filled with observations written in tidy, deliberate handwriting. There were photocopies of deeds, screenshots of Michael's email exchanges with estate agents in Lagos, proof of withdrawals from their joint account used to finance unknown business ventures. Evelyn didn't know the full details of the ventures, but she knew enough to piece together that Michael had been laundering money in someone else's name. The shocking part wasn't even the betrayal, it was the arrogance. He didn't think she could understand banking codes, or that she would recognize the importance of certain reference numbers. He thought her mind was as dull as her silence. And that was where his foolishness began to bloom. Evelyn read every financial alert, every message that appeared on their shared tablet, even the ones he thought were deleted. What he never realized was that Evelyn's quietness didn't mean she wasn't looking. It meant she was reading the fine print of his lies, slowly and thoroughly. She learned to make copies, not just photographs. She mailed documents to a safe P.O. box under a false name in Nsukka. She even paid a private investigator once, a soft-spoken man from Aka who called her Madam, and delivered a brown envelope with names, photos, and a pattern of travel logs that exposed every mistress Michael had paraded in the last 18 months. Evelyn didn't cry when she saw them. She just stapled each photo to its matching location receipt and slid them into the folder like puzzle pieces. It wasn't pain anymore. It was proof. Michael's public life, however, was becoming louder. His friends began noticing that he laughed harder at jokes that weren't funny. He bought new suits, dyed the gray in his beard, and drove a different car each week. People assumed he was happy, that he had finally found freedom from a loveless home. But his laughter was the kind that echoed too long, like the clanging of an empty bell. Beneath the surface of his showmanship, there was a growing restlessness, a frantic energy that he masked with noise. He threw 2 lavish parties within 3 months, invited half of Enugu's political class, and made loud declarations about being a man who won't be dragged down by dead weight. The dead weight, of course, was Evelyn, though he never said her name. He started whispering rumors into the ears of key people, pastors, lawyers, community leaders. He said Evelyn was broken, that she was emotionally unstable, that she had gone through a quiet depression after their failed attempts to have children. It was a slow campaign, deliberate and well-timed. By the time he filed for divorce and requested a public hearing, Many had already made up their minds. Poor Michael. That woman drained him. No wonder he wants his freedom. He smiled through it all, like a man handing out wedding invitations. But even as he smiled, something began to trouble his sleep. Small things. Lost receipts. A page missing from his office ledger. A client who said Evelyn had once called. He dismissed them at first. Coincidences. But Michael, despite his arrogance, had a sense for danger. And sometimes, in the still of night, he'd sit up in bed and stare into the dark hallway, half expecting to see her there, watching. Not with hate, not with tears, but with the same expressionless face she wore when he insulted her dinner. And that, more than anything, terrified him. It was in the 3rd week of July when Michael received a letter from the court, informing him that Evelyn had agreed to the public hearing and had submitted her own files for evidence. That night, he sat for hours on the back balcony, phone in hand, brows furrowed, as the wind rustled the mango trees behind their compound. His lawyer had assured him that no Nigerian woman, especially one as docile as Evelyn, would fight a man with his resources. He had built the case on that assumption. But now he wasn't so sure. Evelyn hadn't said a word. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't threatened. But the quietness, it was beginning to look like preparation. He opened a bottle of whiskey and tried to call one of his mistresses, but she didn't pick up. It started raining again, harder this time, and he watched as drops danced on the tiles like mocking laughter. He remembered something his grandmother once said in Abakaliki when he was a child. If your goat stops bleeding and starts watching, check your fence. She may not run, but she might open the gate. For the first time in years, Michael felt something that made his chest tighten, something heavier than anger, sharper than guilt. It was fear, not of Evelyn's strength, but of the fact that he never truly understood her. He mistook her silence for surrender. He forgot that even an empty drum has echoes. And Evelyn? She was no drum. She was a sealed pot on slow fire. The early days of August in Enugu came with a dry wind that carried more than just dust. It carried rumors, heavy and fast, like birds fleeing a storm no one had seen yet. On one such afternoon, a low hum settled around the Ward household, the kind that usually came before a generator kicked in or a secret was about to surface. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, peeling yams with quiet precision. Her hands moved with an almost rhythmic grace, like a person who had learned to make work into prayer. Across the compound, the sound of Michael's voice echoed on the phone, laughter dripping with artificial sweetness. He was entertaining another business associate, a man he hoped would fund the hotel project he had secretly started in Port Harcourt. He didn't know Evelyn had already seen the proposal months ago, neatly folded inside a brown envelope he'd left behind during one of his reckless mornings. She'd read every line, understood the silent theft behind his confidence, and placed the papers back exactly where he left them. That was her method: observe, record, and return. She never disturbed the order of his lies. She simply marked their timeline. The yam boiled. The knife returned to its rack. Evelyn wiped her hands slowly, removed her apron, and walked into her study. There, on the old wooden desk beside a stack of receipts, was the letter from the court listing the official hearing date. It was underlined in red, August 22nd, 10 a.m. She placed her palm over the ink, closed her eyes for a moment, and whispered something only the room could hear. Not a prayer, not a wish, just a breath released from lungs that had held too much for too long. The folder had grown heavier than she remembered. Inside it were pieces of truth that couldn't be denied, evidence of a man who had built his life on deception, of a marriage where love was buried beneath receipts and bruises. One document was from a nurse in Umuahia who had stitched her lip 3 years prior after Michael slapped her so hard during a dinner argument that she bled into her food. She had told the nurse she fell. The woman had looked at her for a long time, eyes full of understanding and disbelief, and wrote down the actual cause anyway. Evelyn had filed the record quietly under Health, 2019. There were messages between Michael and a woman in Benin, emails that revealed not only affairs but business manipulation. He had shifted contracts from their joint estate management company to one bearing a fake name, his cousin's daughter, whose identity he used to divert rent payments and profits. Evelyn didn't confront him. She made copies. Then there were the voice recordings, collected over time. She had placed a small digital recorder under the dashboard of his car, given to her by Jonah, the young lawyer from Akka who had once interned with a human rights firm. Jonah had not asked unnecessary questions. The first time Evelyn showed him her documents, he looked at her not with pity, but with a kind of quiet reverence. He listened, nodding slowly as she explained how each item was collected. He didn't tell her she was brave. He didn't call her a victim. He simply said, "We build the case from the spine outward. This folder? It's your spine." She trusted him more than anyone. He never assumed. He never underestimated her. The two of them met twice a week in a quiet office behind a tailor's shop in Accra layout. Each meeting was deliberate, quiet, and layered with meaning. They didn't rush. Evelyn hated rushing. Everything had to be calm, methodical, like the slow drawing of a bow before the arrow flies. Michael had grown louder, as though trying to drown out something only he could hear. He began making rounds to friends and church leaders, pushing the story of a failed marriage that was held together only by sentiment. He said Evelyn had changed, that she no longer touched him, no longer served him with love. In a gathering at a friend's compound in Abakaliki, he told the men seated under the mango tree that he was a man tied to a shadow, and that he needed release to find his happiness. The men nodded, some genuinely sympathetic, others simply enjoying the performance. One of them, a rotund man named Chief Amobi, leaned in and asked, "So why the public court, my brother? Ye fit scatter your business, image o." Michael had laughed, tilting his glass of Hennessy. "Let the whole world see. I no day fear disgrace when I get truth." But deep down, his bravado had cracks. He noticed the calls from one of his mistresses had stopped. A property partner in ABA had pulled out of a deal last minute. There were whispers that Evelyn had spoken to someone in their church's welfare department, and that someone had requested documents. Michael dismissed it all as coincidences, but even he knew that too many scattered feathers often pointed to a slaughtered bird. His sleep became restless. His phone always close by. Every call from a blocked number made his palms sweat. And still, Evelyn said nothing. She greeted him in the mornings. She served his meals. She even polished his shoes one Sunday before church. But her eyes no longer blinked in fear. They observed. And Michael was beginning to realize that sometimes silence was not surrender, it was strategy. The day before the court hearing, Enugu was drenched in heat. The air was thick, not with rain, but with waiting. Evelyn spent most of that day arranging her papers. Not for drama, not for vengeance, but for order. She labeled each section with quiet dignity. Financial, emotional harm, asset misuse, medical evidence, and a final envelope simply marked, property theft nui. She placed each in a larger envelope, zipped up the leather folder, and locked it inside the bottom drawer of her desk. She then packed a plain handbag, ironed a modest blue dress, and cleaned her glasses. That night, she didn't pray out loud. She watered her plants, fed the neighbor's cat that always came to her porch, and wrote a small note to herself on a yellow sticky pad. Speak only what the papers cannot say. Michael, meanwhile, spent the evening pacing his study, going over his statement with Barrister Danlamy, drinking too fast and laughing too loud. When the lawyer left, he stood in front of the mirror for almost 20 minutes, practicing his tone, measured, remorseful, injured. He even pulled out a handkerchief, in case he needed to feign tears. But no matter how many lines he rehearsed, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his bones. His house was too quiet, too still. Evelyn was not the kind of woman who plotted chaos, but she was the kind who could hold a storm in her pocket and wait for the perfect day to release it. As he lay in bed, he glanced at her sleeping form beside him. Her face was calm, like a woman who had already won. He turned away and closed his eyes, but sleep evaded him. Because deep inside, he knew, he had planned the crowd, the press, the courtroom. But Evelyn had planned the silence after the noise. The courtroom at Enugu High Court carried the scent of polished wood and old dust, the kind of mixture that settles in places where too many truths have been buried under paperwork. The sun had barely lifted its full face over the city before the compound was buzzing with people. Lawyers in black robes walking briskly, journalists adjusting their microphones, spectators whispering predictions like gamblers outside a betting house. Michael arrived just after 9, stepping out of his tinted Prado with the kind of poise he believed belonged to kings. His agbada was crisp, white, and embroidered with gold thread that shimmered each time he moved. His entourage of friends and 2 junior lawyers followed closely, clearing a path for him like a modern-day procession. People greeted him, some with respect, others with curiosity, but all with the understanding that today was his show. He had staged this hearing deliberately, had told enough people to ensure the courtroom would be filled. This was not merely about dissolving a marriage. This was about putting Evelyn on display, proving to the world that he, Michael Ward, had been the long-suffering husband of a bitter, barren woman who had drained his light. He wore a small smile as he walked through the doors, not because he was happy, but because he had convinced himself there was nothing to fear. To him, Evelyn was predictable, too gentle, too quiet, too soft to fight. But just as he took his seat beside his lawyer and glanced toward the entrance, she walked in. Evelyn entered the courtroom wearing the same calmness she had worn through years of neglect, humiliation, and silence. Her dress was simple, sky-blue cotton with soft embroidery along the collar. Her shoes were modest. Her hair was wrapped in a dark scarf with silver threading. She held no handbag, only the familiar leather folder, tucked under her arm like a sleeping child. There was nothing dramatic about her entrance. No one stood to greet her. No one gasped. And yet, the room changed. Something in the atmosphere shifted like wind in the bush just before an animal pounces. Those who had come expecting to see a broken woman fumble her way through tears suddenly sat a little straighter. Michael, who had rehearsed a dozen expressions in front of his mirror the night before, could not find the one he needed now. She took her seat beside Jonah without looking in his direction. Jonah greeted her with a subtle nod, his eyes already scanning the faces in the crowd, then glancing at the judge's seat, which remained empty for now. Court clerks moved about with practiced indifference, but even they occasionally glanced at the woman with the folder. Evelyn opened it briefly, ran her fingers over the dividers, and closed it again. Michael leaned towards his lawyer, whispered something, then looked back at her. But Evelyn never lifted her eyes. She sat like someone waiting for the kettle to boil, as if she knew it would, eventually. The judge arrived shortly after 10, a woman in her early 60s with glasses perched at the tip of her nose, and the kind of expression that warned people not to waste her time. She opened the docket, scanned the names, and motioned for the opening statements. Michael's lawyer rose confidently. He spoke with practiced sympathy, painting Michael as a man shackled to a wife who had abandoned the emotional core of their union, who had denied him warmth, affection, even decency. He used words like psychological distress, emotional fatigue, and irreparable damage. He painted Evelyn as cold, manipulative, possibly unstable. Michael nodded subtly as the speech went on, but his confidence began to peel the moment Evelyn stood. She did not interrupt. She did not speak over anyone. She waited for silence. Then, in a voice low and clear, she addressed the court. "I have a folder that holds the things he left behind," she said. "Not clothes or memories, but documents, receipts, messages, the kind of things you can't wash out of truth." The room hushed. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Evelyn handed Jonah the first section labeled Financial Misconduct. Jonah stepped forward, passed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. It began, one document at a time. Unauthorized withdrawals from their joint accounts. A fake business registration in ABA traced back to Michael's cousin. Property sale agreements signed using forged documents. Evelyn explained none of it. The papers spoke. Then came the messages. Emails from mistresses. Hotel bookings paid from their shared funds. A letter written by Michael to one of the women, promising to relocate her to Ghana using cleared money. The silence in the room deepened, as if every wall was holding its breath. What broke the courtroom stillness wasn't shouting or arguing, but the soft gasp of a woman in the back row, followed by a thud as someone's pen dropped to the floor. Even Michael's lawyer adjusted his collar, his earlier swagger now visibly shrinking. The final folder, marked personal harm, was shorter. Only a few documents. A photograph of Evelyn's stitched lip, dated and signed by the nurse. A statement from a former housemaid who had witnessed an incident but had been paid off to stay quiet. Then, a printed email exchange between Michael and a therapist he had briefly consulted, where he admitted to occasionally losing control. Michael tried to object, but the judge raised a single hand. "Sit down." Her voice was cold, firm. "Let her finish." Evelyn looked directly at the judge and said, "This folder doesn't just prove the end of a marriage. It records the parts that died long before today. I do not need vengeance. Only acknowledgement." Jonah handed over the final document, a signed affidavit from Evelyn's father's lawyer stating that Michael had, without permission, attempted to sell land in Nui that did not belong to him. It was a clean legal statement, carrying more weight than any speech. Michael stood suddenly. "She forged all of this," he said, voice breaking. But there was no support in the room. His words fell like leaves in harmattan, dry, brittle, easily swept aside. The judge motioned to the clerk. "I want everything copied. Full review. Schedule follow-up on all fraudulent claims." She looked at Michael like someone studying a once beautiful painting now smeared with dirt. You came here for public truth, she said. Now you'll live with it. Evelyn said nothing more. She closed her folder slowly and sat back. The courtroom, which had come to watch her fall, now sat in reverent silence, not of guilt, not of pity, but of recognition. The woman who had said the least had ended up saying the most. The corridors of the courthouse were quieter than usual the following day. Though the crowd had dispersed after the hearing, whispers still hovered in corners like perfume that clings long after the person has left the room. Clerks avoided eye contact with Michael as they walked past, their once friendly greetings now replaced by a shallow nod or a glance too brief to register. Michael himself sat in the lawyer's waiting room, staring at a wall that seemed to be closing in on him. His igbata was still fresh, but it no longer held the same grace. It clung awkwardly to him, like fabric borrowed from a man who no longer existed. Beside him, Barrister Danlamy fidgeted with his pen, unsure of how to begin the conversation neither of them wanted to have. "Sir," the lawyer finally said, his voice cautious, "we need to talk damage control. The judge's decision on restitution, that could affect your business licenses. There are fraud claims now. Property misappropriation, too." Michael blinked slowly. He heard the words, but they didn't land. He wasn't thinking about licenses or hearings. He was thinking about the folder. That cursed folder that Evelyn had carried like a weapon of quiet memory. He remembered the way she had passed it to her lawyer with such calm, no trembling in her hands, no shaking in her voice. Just control. Pure, terrifying control. He had always believed silence was weakness. But now, he realized silence was a storm waiting for its hour. And his hour had come. In the days that followed, the mood in Enugu shifted like weather that refused to follow the forecast. At first, there was confusion. People who had sided with Michael, neighbors, pastors, family friends, found themselves struggling to reconcile what they had seen in court. The documents weren't vague. They weren't emotional pleas or dramatized recollections. They were concrete, stamped, time-stamped, undeniable. A respected elder from Michael's village in Nsukka, who had once said Evelyn was too quiet to be trustworthy, called her privately through a mutual contact to apologize. He couldn't find the right words, so he left a message. "I misunderstood you. May your spirit find rest." Evelyn did not return the call. She didn't need to. The world was already adjusting itself around the truth, and for once, she did not have to lift a finger. Meanwhile, Michael tried to spin a new narrative, this time about betrayal. "She was recording me like a spy," he told anyone who would listen. "She plotted all this from the start. She's not the victim, she's the villain." But the more he spoke, the more people tuned him out. In the court of public opinion, Evelyn's silence still rang louder. Shops where Michael once walked in and got handshakes now served him with cold professionalism. Even the staff at his real estate firm in Independence Layout had begun quietly looking for other jobs. Rumors of frozen accounts and revoked contracts began spreading. His business partner in Owerri pulled out of a joint land development without offering explanation. It wasn't scandal that scared people, it was proof. And Evelyn had served enough of it to last a lifetime. Evelyn, for her part, didn't retreat from the public eye. She didn't hide or leave town. She remained in her home for the time being, moving through her routines with the same unhurried grace she had always carried. But something in her presence had shifted. It wasn't pride. It wasn't vengeance. It was something deeper, like a person who had walked barefoot over broken glass and now found herself on smooth ground again. A local journalist tried to reach her for an exclusive interview, hoping to capture a headline from the most talked-about woman in the region. Evelyn declined, not because she had nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said. The folder had spoken, and when truth speaks clearly, it doesn't need an encore. She spent her mornings tending to the flowers in her front yard, accepting brief greetings from neighbors without ceremony. There was a woman across the street, Mrs. Kalu, who had once believed the worst about her. One morning, she sent her teenage son across with a small bowl of vegetable soup. Evelyn accepted it with a small smile. That was all the response necessary. She no longer needed vindication. What she had earned was dignity, and that could not be traded or explained. In the evenings, she sat on her veranda, sometimes reading, sometimes watching the sky change colors without looking for messages in it. Peace, she realized, was not always loud or triumphant. Sometimes it was quiet, tucked into ordinary moments. And after years of watching herself disappear beneath someone else's shadow, she was finally beginning to see her own reflection again. One afternoon, 2 weeks after the hearing, Michael stood alone in his office, staring out at a view that once made him feel untouchable. The city spread before him like an empire. But now every building he saw reminded him of something Evelyn had once said in passing. If you build on stolen ground, the house won't stand through the rain. He hadn't understood it then. But he understood now. Calls to old allies went unanswered. His lawyer sent him updates in dry, clinical language. The judge had demanded a formal audit of his financial records. His cousin, whose name he'd used on those fake property documents, was now refusing to cooperate. Even his mother had called him once, not to scold, but to ask, "What did that woman show the world that you were so afraid of?" Michael had no answer. Because the truth was, he hadn't feared Evelyn's strength. He had feared her memory. He never imagined she had the patience to gather, arrange, and reveal with the precision of a historian. Now, as he paced the room, he felt something clawing at the edges of his pride, regret, not just for being exposed, but for ever underestimating the one person who had once loved him quietly. The one he ignored, mocked, betrayed. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't sought revenge. She had simply allowed time and evidence to do what rage could not. He poured himself a drink, the liquid trembling slightly as it hit the glass, and sat down slowly. He didn't cry. Not because he wasn't broken, but because he finally understood what it meant to be silent. Not empty. Not defeated. Just seen. The morning air in Enugu carried a different weight now, as though the city itself had exhaled something it had been holding in for too long. People still talked, of course. Human tongues do not go quiet when a tale this gripping has passed through their markets and homes, but the tone had changed. No longer dripping with gossip or suspicion, but softened into something closer to respect. Or perhaps caution. The story of Evelyn and Michael Ward had stopped being entertainment. It had become a kind of mirror people weren't entirely comfortable looking into. Evelyn, for her part, did not walk with the pride of someone who had won anything. She simply walked lighter. On the morning her lawyer delivered the court's final ruling to her, an envelope stamped and signed with legal closure, she read it once, placed it on her reading table, and returned to trimming the edges of her bougainvillea bush. Her quietness hadn't faded, it had just changed shape. It was no longer the silence of someone carrying pain. It had become the silence of someone who no longer owed the world an explanation. Inside the envelope was everything one might call justice: a formal dissolution of marriage, ownership of the family property, financial restitution, and a court order restricting Michael from attempting contact beyond legal boundaries. But Evelyn didn't linger on the paper. She had carried justice for years before it wore legal shoes. She had earned her peace long before the stamp. Michael's name still floated in conversations, but it no longer carried the shine it once did. He still lived in the city, though his movements had grown more discreet. The flamboyant parties, the loud declarations, the casual handshakes had all disappeared. His phone still rang, but it was mostly with questions he couldn't answer or problems he no longer had the influence to redirect. Some people still offered him sympathy, those who felt overwhelmed by how public his fall had been, but most simply watched him with the polite discomfort reserved for people who had once been something they could no longer pretend to admire. Michael tried to restart projects. He restructured his real estate firm, fired some old staff, hired new consultants, but the cracks had already reached the foundation. Investors were hesitant. Partnerships dissolved quietly. A former ally from Abuja, who had once spoken about joint ventures, withdrew his interest without offering much explanation. And though no one said it directly, Michael began to understand that his reputation had become more of a caution than a currency. It wasn't Evelyn's folder that undid him. It was the fact that the folder had never needed lies to be powerful. The documents were real. The dates matched. The signatures were his. That was what left people uneasy, how factual her silence had been. He would sometimes sit in his office and stare at the same files he once used to command respect, now tainted by exposure. His driver, a man who had worked for him for nearly 7 years, resigned without warning. Michael didn't ask why. He knew that even loyalty wears out when soaked in too many secrets. Evelyn chose to leave the house 1 month after the final judgment. She didn't sell it, didn't burn it, didn't deface it in any way. She simply locked the front door, handed the keys to her lawyer for safekeeping, and left a single note in the master bedroom. This was never mine, only borrowed time. She relocated to a smaller home in Nsukka, not far from where she had grown up, a quiet place near a school library where the air was cleaner and the noise more purposeful. Her new space had fewer rooms, fewer walls, but more sun. She began volunteering at a reading club for girls aged 12 to 16, most of them bright-eyed and eager, some quiet like she used to be. Evelyn never told them her story. She didn't need to. She helped them pick books. She showed them how to annotate pages, how to write short reflections, how to sit with words until they no longer felt foreign. The girls loved her, not because she had a story, but because she gave them space to have their own. Every now and then, an old friend would call to ask how she was adjusting, and she'd respond with a voice so steady it surprised even her. "I am well," she'd say. "I'm not rebuilding. I'm just being." She had no interest in becoming a symbol, no desire to speak on panels or write about survival. What she wanted was air and time, and the sound of her own breath returning without resistance. And each time she sat outside in the evening, with the fading sun brushing her skin, she would smile, not because she had beaten anyone, but because she had reclaimed something. Herself. On one rainy morning in September, Michael stood outside the house he once shared with Evelyn, staring at the gate like a man waiting for an answer he didn't know how to ask. He had come not to beg, not to apologize, but because something about the silence in his life had started to resemble hers. And in that silence he heard echoes of all the words he had flung carelessly, of all the nights he'd chosen arrogance over honesty. He didn't enter. The gate was locked, the curtains drawn. A new tenant had not yet moved in. The house sat still, like a body that had been drained of its soul. He turned away eventually, soaked to the bone, and walked back to his car. As he drove off, he passed by a billboard for a women's literacy campaign. The slogan read, "Every voice begins with a word." He didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. He just stared at it until the traffic light turned green. And somewhere in that brief pause between red and green, between regret and consequence, Michael felt something settle in him. Not peace, not understanding, just a quiet knowing that some stories do not end with a bang or a tear, but with the weight of silence that can no longer be denied. Evelyn's silence had not only defended her, it had revealed him, and no amount of noise could ever bury that. Sometimes silence is not weakness, it is wisdom. Not every battle is fought with noise. Some victories are built with patience, truth, and quiet strength. Don't be in a hurry to prove yourself. When your time comes, let your truth speak for you. And never mistake calmness for surrender. Protect your peace, guard your dignity, and walk with your head high, even when the world is watching for you to fall. Those who walk with truth may walk slowly, but they never walk alone. May your voice never be drowned by lies. May your truth rise, even in rooms where your name was dragged through the mud. May your patience become power, and your silence speak volumes. Every pain you've carried in private, may God turn it into public restoration. May you never be disgraced where you've been faithful. May those who plot your downfall fall into their own pits. Your peace will be full. Your wisdom will not fail. And when your day of truth comes, may the world stand still and listen. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.